Daniel Dillon, The Blackmail Letters, written by Tane Blackadder, read by Arthur Howard. The relentless downpour had at long last exhausted itself, but the city refused to heal. A stubborn, damp haze lingered, a spectral presence that clung to the grimy windows of Mel's Griddle, smearing the outside world into a watercolor of blurred neon and gloom. This wasn't a cleansing mist. It was a pall, the kind of oppressive quiet that follows a scream. Inside our booth, the silence felt heavy, lived in. We were marinating in the aftermath. The Sanderson case was technically closed, a file shut and stored away. But its ghost lingered in the space between us. It was a sutured wound, yes, but the scar beneath was new and hypersensitive, pulling taut with every memory. A low, persistent hum of disquiet thrummed just beneath the calm, a silent alarm reminding us that the world we navigated was one where trust could be a weapon, and a home could become a prison in the space of a single night. The peace was an illusion, and we were all waiting for the next tremor to shatter it. Sarah was with us. That simple three-word statement had crystallized into the most profound and unshakable truth of our new reality. She was no longer a guest in our world of shadows. She had become a foundational part of its architecture. In her now customary spot in the booth, she was a study in focused transformation. The textbook on forensic accounting I'd scavenged for her lay open on the formica, its dense paragraphs and complex charts a stark contrast to the medical journals that had once been her domain. Her brow was knitted in concentration, a single finger tracing a line of text as she committed this new, harsh language of financial deception to memory. The sight was, to be honest, both jarring and deeply comforting, a testament to a spirit that refused to be broken, choosing instead to reinvent itself for the fight. And Daniel, he watched her. It wasn't the vacant stare of the man haunted by his past that I had grown accustomed to over 2 long years. No, this was something entirely new, something alive and intensely present. From over the rim of his chipped ceramic mug, his gaze held a complexity I struggled to define. There was a ferocious, almost primal protectiveness there, the look of a man who had already lost one world and would incinerate this one before losing another. But layered beneath that was a quiet, dawning reverence, a genuine awe for the sheer force of will it took to sit in that very booth, to channel unspeakable trauma into studious application. The air between them seemed to vibrate, charged with a potent and unspoken tension. It was a silent, resonant field, built on shared pain and a mutual, unacknowledged recognition. You could feel it, a palpable energy that made the very atmosphere in our grimy corner of the diner feel fragile, as if the next spoken word might either shatter it or cause it to bloom into something undeniable. The fragile peace we had carved out was annihilated in an instant. The phone's ring wasn't merely an interruption. It was a violent intrusion, a shard of jagged glass hurled into the delicate quiet of the booth. That specific jarring jangle belonged to our line, the one listed in the paper, the number that never summoned anything but trouble. We had learned to recognize the nuances of its distress calls. This tone, however, was unfamiliar. It lacked the raw, weeping desperation of Henry Claymore, whose brother had vanished from a doomed flight. It carried none of the frantic, static-laced terror we'd heard from Ilara Cruz, whose world had collapsed into a nightmare of corporate conspiracy. No, this was something else entirely. This ring was cold, authoritative. Each electronic pulse was a precise, measured beat devoid of panic, resonating with an ominous, judicial weight. It was the sound of institution power, not personal tragedy. A sound more like a judge's gavel falling in a silent courtroom than a cry for help. My eyes snapped up from my laptop screen, and across the table Daniel's gaze met mine. No words were necessary. In that locked glance passed an entire weary conversation, It was a silent acknowledgment of the shattered calm, and a grim, unspoken question hanging in the newly charged air. Which fresh hell is this? He was the one who moved, his hand extending with a deliberate, almost reluctant slowness that seemed to measure the gravity of the sound. His fingers closed around the worn plastic receiver, a soldier answering a command he never wanted to hear. He brought it to his ear, his posture shifting into a mask of neutral readiness. "Dylan," he said, his voice a flat, uninflected instrument, deliberately stripped of all emotion, a dam holding back the torrent of another person's crisis. The single word was not a greeting, but a declaration of entry into another world of darkness. For a full 60 seconds, Daniel became a statue, the receiver pressed to his ear. His face was a masterwork of impassive neutrality, a granite mask giving nothing away to the naked eye. But I had spent 2 years studying the micro-expressions that flickered across that weathered landscape. I saw it, the almost imperceptible tightening of the skin at the corners of his eyes, a minute constriction that was as telling as a shouted confession. It was his tell. The silent alarm that signaled the person on the other end of the line was not just another desperate soul, but someone accustomed to command, yet whose voice was now laced with the cold, metallic taste of genuine fear. This was a particular kind of danger, the kind that came with resources and influence, the kind that could bury truths deep. His first words were not a greeting, but a wall. "We don't do politics," he stated, his voice low and flat, each syllable a brick laid with definitive finality. It was a principle, a line in the sand drawn from bitter experience. A heavy pause followed, filled only by the faint tinny whisper of the voice on the other end pleading its case. I watched the muscle in his jaw bunch and tighten, a ripple of tension beneath the skin. He was listening, and he didn't like what he was hearing. "The content is the job," he interrupted, his voice gaining a sharp, clarifying edge. "Not the title." He was making a distinction, a crucial one for him. He would engage with the sin, but not the sinner's office. Another silence stretched out, longer this time, more profound. The unseen speaker was wearing him down, presenting a reality so compelling it was bending his own rules. Then came the sigh. It was a soft, weary exhalation that seemed to drain the resistance from his shoulders, a sound that carried the cumulative weight of every dark corridor and moral compromise we'd ever navigated. It was the sound of surrender to the inevitable. 1 hour. The 2 words were a concession, a sentence. He hung up the phone, the click of the receiver a period at the end of a conversation that had already pulled us into its orbit. The name landed in the quiet of the booth not with a whisper, but with the heavy final thud of a stone dropped into still water. Eric Harris. Daniel let it hang there, the 2 syllables dense with implication. He continued, his voice low, painting a portrait of power with a few grim strokes. "City Comptroller. The man whose signature authorizes the flow of capital to half the public works projects in this city. The guardian of the public purse." A brief, cynical pause. "And he's being blackmailed." My mind, the part of me that will always be an accountant first, immediately began its cold calculus. "What's the demand?" I asked, the gears already turning, mentally tracing routes through Cayman Islands banks and shell corporations, estimating the psychological price of silence. "A sum? Transfers?" Daniel's gaze didn't flicker towards me. Instead, it shifted almost instinctively to Sarah. It was a deliberate, unspoken inclusion, a silent briefing that acknowledged her place at the table as absolute. "Not money," he said, and the words reframed the entire threat. This was far more dangerous than simple greed. They want him to strangle a specific audit in its crib, a deep-dive forensic examination into the city's municipal energy contracts. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on the formica, her multi-billion-dollar river of public funds. A cold dread, an old and familiar acquaintance, wrapped itself around my spine. The pieces clicked into a terrifyingly familiar pattern. Aetherius, I breathed, the name itself feeling like a contamination in the air. In our world it was a curse. We had confronted their monstrous ambition before, in the reality-bending horror of Project Palimpsest, where they tried to scrape back the layers of existence itself, and in the chilling actuarial prophecies of Peter Claymore, who calculated disaster for profit. They weren't just a corporation. They were a metastatic cancer woven into the city's vital infrastructure. Or a creature from the same ecosystem, Daniel conceded with a grim nod. But that's not what makes this different. That's not the real problem here. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing us to lean in, creating a confidential circle within the public diner. The problem is the blackmail itself, the specificity of it. He began to list the details, and with each one the room seemed to grow colder. The brand of his wife's perfume. Not just the brand, but that she wore it on the night of the mayor's charity gala 2 years ago. The exact amount of a cash donation he accepted from a known syndicate enforcer 20 years ago, a figure he swears he never recorded, never spoke aloud, a number that existed only in his head and presumably the enforcer's. And the worst one, Daniel's own voice grew softer, almost reluctant to give voice to the violation, the specific word-for-word phrasing of a private, desperate prayer he uttered when he thought he was alone, kneeling in a hospital chapel the night his son's car was T-boned by a drunk driver. A prayer his son never even knew about. Sarah sucked in a sharp, hissed breath, her hand moving unconsciously to her throat. "My God," she whispered, "that's not surveillance. That's violation. It's psychological dissection. It's like the sender wasn't just watching him through a window. It's like they were standing right beside him, inside his most private moments. It's like they were a ghost in the room." "Exactly," Daniel said, the word heavy with grim confirmation. And according to Harris, there was only one other person alive who was a confidant for some of these secrets, especially that mob donation. His old campaign manager, a fixer named David Rossi, a man who knew where all the bodies were buried. He paused, letting the significance of the name settle. David Rossi died 6 months ago. A hit and run. The case is as cold as the ground he's in. He looked from Sarah's horrified face to my own. We're not being hired by a politician to fight a corporation. We're being hired to investigate a ghost. And so the grim, familiar dance commenced. Eric Harris arrived not with an entourage, but alone, a solitary figure carrying the weight of his crumbling world into our dimly lit booth. He was a man sculpted for television, for press conferences held in clean, well-lit rooms, but here, under Mel's flickering fluorescence, the facade was cracking. He moved with a stiff, practiced formality, trying to project an air of unshakable authority, but the performance was betrayed by a faint, persistent tremor in his hands as he passed over a slim, unassuming manila folder. Inside were the ghosts, photocopies of the letters that were systematically dismantling his life. The paper itself was a message. Cheap, pulpy stock, the kind bought in bulk from any corner store, utterly anonymous. The words were stamped onto the page by the forceful impact of a manual typewriter, each character a tiny monument to pre-digital anonymity, leaving no digital fingerprint to trace. The postmarks were a chaotic, mocking geography lesson, hailing from different random zip codes across the city's vast expanse, a clear demonstration of meticulous, untraceable movement. The methodology was, in its own chilling way, flawless, a perfect symphony of obscurity. But it was the content that defied all logic or reason. The technique was impeccably, clinically mundane. But the knowledge contained within the knowledge was nothing short of impossible. Our investigation transformed into a form of modern séance, a haunting where we were the ones pursued by the phantom. We weren't just following clues. We were chasing the lingering echo of a man 6 months in the grave. Daniel became a shadow in the city's forgotten corners, moving through the haunts of political operatives and washed-up fixers. He leaned on his network of whispers, pressing for any fragment of memory, any lingering resentment tied to David Rossi. He was seeking the human stain Rossi had left behind, a bitter ex-lover, a double-crossed associate, anyone whose grudge had outlived its target. While Daniel navigated that world of flesh and consequence, Sarah and I descended into a different kind of underworld. We became digital archaeologists. Our tools not brushes and trowels, but keyboards and decryption software. We began the meticulous excavation of Rossi's second life, the one lived in the cold light of screens. We sifted through the sedimentary layers of his existence, the brash strategic boasts in old emails, the silent telling story of his financial currents, even the intimate vulnerabilities buried within his medical records. We were no longer just investigators. We were mediums trying to reconstruct a ghost from the digital ectoplasm it left behind, hoping the phantom would whisper its secrets to us. It was as if we were walking through a gallery of closed cases, each one a monument to finality. Every potential lead we unearthed seemed to terminate at a fresh headstone. We discovered a payment to a private investigator, a substantial sum, but the case it was meant to advance had been abruptly concluded when the person under scrutiny was killed in a single car accident. A cryptic, tantalizing entry in Rossi's digital calendar, just a time and the word verity, led us to a potential informant, only to find she had lost a swift, brutal battle with pancreatic cancer months prior. The most chilling discovery was a safe deposit box, secured under a clever alias that took us days to crack. Inside, we found a dossier of documents so damning it could have toppled a city councilman. But the magnate named in the files, a man known for his brutal business tactics, had been discovered in his study, the victim of what the coroner ruled a massive coronary. A mere fortnight after Rossi's own life was erased on that rain-slicked street, we weren't just following a trail. We were cataloguing a pattern of permanent silences. It felt less like an investigation and more like an exhumation, with every shovelful of dirt revealing another corpse. The truth wasn't just buried. It was lying in a cemetery, and we were reading the epitaphs. The breakthrough didn't come from the shadowy underworld or a complex algorithm, but from the quiet, methodical mind of a healer. While Daniel chased ghosts in the city's underbelly, and I wrestled with encrypted files, Sarah was engaged in a different kind of diagnostics. With a nurse's innate understanding of cycles and rhythms, she was meticulously cross-referencing the timeline of the harassment against Rossi's old phone records, searching not for a name but for a heartbeat, a pattern in the pulse of the persecution. Suddenly she went perfectly still, her focus sharpening to a laser point. She leaned forward, her finger tapping the screen with a soft, definitive click. "We've been looking at this wrong," she said, her voice hushed but vibrating with the thrill of discovery. "It's not about the postmark the day they were sent. It's about the delivery, the day they landed in Harris's mailbox. That's the trigger. They always arrive on a Tuesday." She swiveled the laptop toward us, her eyes alight. "And look here. For the entire 6 months leading up to his death, David Rossi's calendar was a study in routine. Every single Tuesday morning, like clockwork, he had a standing appointment." She paused, letting the significance hang in the air. "A therapy session. He was in that office, talking, confessing every week. Someone wasn't just stealing his secrets after he died. They were harvesting them while he was still alive." The therapist, a Dr. Albright, represented a fortress guarded by the most formidable wall in our world, patient confidentiality. It was a barrier as impenetrable as any vault we had ever encountered, sealed by law and professional ethics. But the thread Sarah had pulled was undeniable, shimmering with terrible implication. Rossi had been talking week after week, unburdening himself. In that sanctified space, he had poured out not just his own fears, but the toxic secrets of his powerful clients, including the darkest truths of Eric Harris, into a trusted, confidential ear. The knowledge had been alive in that room, a currency of confession. The breach in this formidable wall, however, came not from a confrontation, but from the most pedestrian of sources, the relentless telling flow of money. While Daniel devised an elaborate pretext to engage Dr. Albright directly, hoping to spot a crack in her professional armor, I retreated into my natural element, the digital ledger. I began tracing the financial outflow from the therapist's practice, a river of electronic transactions, paying for utilities, supplies, and salaries. And there, nestled among the predictable debits, was an anomaly, a consistent monthly automatic payment drafted from the office's main account, destined for a self-storage company across town. The unit number was seared into my memory, a number that carried the ghost of a past nightmare. Unit 42B, the same unit where Judge Atticus's daughter had been held. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a signature. The past had just reached out and tapped us on the shoulder. The number on the screen didn't just register, it detonated. A silent concussion of memory that stole the air from my lungs. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of sudden, chilling recognition. "Daniel," I managed, my voice strained, reduced to a tight whisper. I turned the laptop, my hand unsteady. "Look, it's the same unit, 42B, the exact same number from the Atticus case." The effect on him was immediate and visceral. The color drained from his face, leaving a pallid mask of grim realization. This wasn't a random assignment of digits by a faceless rental company. This was deliberate, a calculated choice. It was a signature, a grotesque flourish from an adversary who not only knew our history but was actively mocking us with it, dragging the ghosts of our past victories into the present struggle. We were no longer just investigating a blackmailer. We were being sent a message by someone who had studied our pain. We returned to that same bleak storage facility in the gauzy light of a misty dawn, the scene a haunting echo of a previous rescue. The air was thick with a disorienting déjà vu, the same damp chill, the same scent of rust and neglect. Daniel approached the familiar roll-up door, his movements a precise replication of that prior morning. The same focused intensity, the same terrifying efficiency as he defeated the lock. But when the door rattled upward, the symmetry shattered. The space within was not a prison cell. There was no terrified child, no menacing guard. The unit was a tomb of inanimate objects. Neat, anonymous cardboard boxes were stacked against the walls, and sitting alone in the center of the concrete floor, like an offering on an altar, was a single sleek silver laptop. Its screen dark and lifeless, but it was the object affixed to the laptop's lid that truly made the world tilt on its axis. Taped neatly across the dead screen was a single physical photograph, its edges softened with age, the colors faded by time. It was a candid shot, capturing a moment of unguarded joy. David Rossi, his face alive with laughter, had his arm thrown casually around the shoulders of a young woman. She was turned toward him, her expression bright with intelligence and a faint, challenging smile. The woman was Sarah. The air in the storage unit turned to ice. The carefully constructed narrative of our investigation, of a ghost haunting a politician, shattered in an instant, replaced by something far more personal and far more terrifying. The taunt was no longer just about our professional history. It was a targeted strike at the very heart of our newly formed trio. Back in the worn vinyl sanctuary of our booth at Mel's, the silence was a physical weight, thick and suffocating. Sarah held the photograph as if it were a venomous insect, her hands trembling. She stared at the frozen image of her younger self, her face a palimpsest of shock, confusion, and a slow creeping horror. I was his nurse," she finally whispered, the words frayed and fragile. "It was years ago, a lifetime before St. Ignatius, a routine procedure. He was charming, disarming, we talked. He said he was a political consultant." Her eyes lifted from the photo, wide with the dawning awful implication. It was just a few shifts. I never made the connection. He was just a patient. The photograph wasn't just evidence. It was a thread, pulled from the tapestry of her past, now threatening to unravel everything. The disparate, jagged fragments of the case suddenly coalesced, locking together with a terrible, grinding finality that felt less like a solution and more like a sentence. The truth was both simpler and more tragic than any corporate conspiracy we had imagined. Rossi, sensing his own mortality, had indeed been confessing his life's work to his therapist, Dr. Albright, but the sanctity of that office had been violated by another presence. The quiet, unassuming woman who managed the appointments and filed the notes, a secretary named Isabel. For years she had harbored a silent, devoted love for David Rossi, a passion he likely never noticed. His sudden, violent death had not ended her devotion. It had curdled it into something dark and vengeful. Consumed by a grief that twisted into a crusade, she began methodically pilfering the session notes, stealing the very soul he had left behind. She became the phantom, a librarian of the departed's most damning truths. The blackmail scheme was her warped memorial, a monument built not of stone but of secrets. She was using the words of the dead to punish the living she believed had exploited him, abandoned him, or simply been unworthy of him. The money was secondary, a means to fund her anonymous existence as the guardian of his ghost. This wasn't about power or politics in the end. It was about a love that had survived the grave, only to transform into a quiet, meticulous form of madness. The weapon wasn't a gun or a threat. It was a broken heart, armed with a dead man's confessions. We stopped her, of course. The mechanism was almost clinical in its execution. Using Eric Harris as reluctant bait, we orchestrated a precise sting operation. Daniel intercepted her not in a dramatic confrontation, but as she performed a furtive, ritualistic act, retrieving a sealed envelope from beneath a park bench, another anonymous dead drop in her sad campaign. The woman, Isabel, offered no resistance. She was a portrait of profound isolation, a hunched and weary figure whose entire world had shrunk to this single destructive purpose. There was no malevolent genius in her eyes, only the hollowed-out exhaustion of a love that had turned in on itself. The secrets, the ones that could have shattered lives and toppled careers, were contained. They were safe, but the cost of that safety felt immeasurably heavy. Later, in the familiar, grimy sanctuary of Mel's, the three of us collapsed into a shared, leaden silence. The case was officially closed, the paperwork a formality. Yet there was no sense of victory, no cleansing satisfaction. It felt instead as though we had spent days grappling not with a living adversary, but with phantoms. We had chased the echo of a dead man's voice, manipulated by the spectral obsession of a grieving woman. We had won, but the victory left a residue of profound melancholy, a chilling reminder that the most dangerous threats are not always born from ambition or greed, but from the twisted, enduring power of a broken heart. The air in the booth was thick with the unspoken question: had we defeated a villain or merely interrupted a long, private tragedy? Daniel's gaze found Sarah across the Formica table, holding her there in a moment of profound stillness. She was visibly pale, grappling with the chilling coincidence that had woven a thread from her past into the fabric of our present nightmare. "You held your nerve," he said, the words emerging low and gravelly, stripped of his usual detachment and rough with a respect that bordered on awe. "Not just today. With the numbers, spotting the rhythm in the chaos. With the pattern, when the rest of us were chasing shadows. With all of it." He paused, his focus dropping to the dark vortex of his coffee as he swirled the mug, a small turbulent storm contained in ceramic. "This life we've built, it isn't a job. It's a permanent state of siege, a storm that just changes direction." He drew a slow, deliberate breath, as if steadying himself for the weight of the next words, his eyes lifting to lock with hers once more, a silent current passing between them. "This booth isn't going anywhere. And that phone," he gave a slight grim nod toward the counter, "it's never going to stop ringing." He wasn't posing a question or issuing an invitation. He was simply stating a fundamental truth of our existence, and within that truth he laid down an offering. "There is a place in this storm for you. A permanent one. If it's what you want." The choice finally was hers. Sarah's gaze swept slowly from Daniel's weathered, intent face to my own, and then back again, as if weighing the anchor she was about to drop. The residual fear was still a visible shadow in her eyes, a natural tremor from the horrors she had endured and uncovered. But now it was eclipsed by something far more powerful, a hard, polished certainty that gleamed with the fierce light of a decision made. She was no longer just a survivor who had been pulled back from the edge. In the crucible of this investigation, she had proven herself a hunter, one who could track a phantom through the digital undergrowth and face down the ghosts of her own past. She had borne witness to the chilling ways history repeats itself, in the taunting echo of a storage unit number, in the relentless reach of a corporation like Etherius, in the cold equations of the statistical dead. She understood, in her bones, that these were not isolated tragedies, but chapters in a single endless story of darkness, and she knew irrevocably that she was now a character woven into its fabric. "I want it," she said. The 3 words were not whispered but declared. Her voice was clear, steady, and carried the finality of a vow. Daniel's response was a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was an acknowledgement that needed no embellishment, but in the look that passed between them, a look that excluded the entire world, even me, I saw the profound truth of the moment. This was not merely a job offer accepted. It was a pact, a silent promise, forged in shared trauma and hardened by mutual respect, that whatever tempests lay ahead, whatever new abysses yawned open, they would now stand against them, not as separate entities, but together. The phone's shrill cry sliced through the moment, a jarring alarm that was both a promise of purpose and a threat of fresh turmoil. Daniel, however, did not flinch toward the sound. He held his gaze on Sarah for one final suspended heartbeat, a silent, profound conversation flowing between them that spoke of a newly forged bond and a shared, daunting path ahead. It was a look that acknowledged the choice she had just made, solidifying their partnership in a way words never could. Then and only then did he turn, his posture shifting from a man making a pledge to a soldier answering a summons. As he moved, the rest of our world snapped back into motion with a grim, practiced synchrony. I flipped open my laptop, the device humming to life, its cool blue glow a familiar and steadying light in the diner's gloom, my fingers already poised above the keys. Sarah, no longer a guest in the booth but a pillar of it, instinctively squared her shoulders, her expression shifting from contemplation to a focused readiness to absorb the next hard lesson. The brief respite was over. The ghost, the ever-present spectre of human frailty, corruption, and tragedy, was once again loose in the world, and the 3 of us, bound by choice and circumstance, had accepted our roles as its permanent, reluctant custodians. The next chapter of our story was already demanding to be written,